Hello, my dear emperors. I'm Marco, and tonight we're drifting into the story of the Cold War, I guess. Why I guess? Because this isn't your usual history lecture. Here, we don't just talk about the Cold War, we speak as if you were one of them. This is a second-person journey, immersive, a little sarcastic, and meant to carry you gently into sleep while your mind wanders through time. From the frozen alleys of Petrograd to the neon glow of capitalist billboards, this story doesn't begin with a wall in Berlin. It begins in the ruins of Imperial Russia, where revolution hangs in the air like frost. Lenin is being smuggled in like a shady Amazon package, and the world is about to choose sides in a battle of paranoia, power, and very uncomfortable ideologies. So if you're up for it, let the world fade, dim the lights, and join me. It begins, as such tales often do, with a man on a train. Vladimir Lenin, Marxist theorist and future face of a million angry statues, was chilling in Switzerland, exiled, disgruntled, and perhaps mildly lactose intolerant. But then Germany, ever the opportunist, had a brilliant idea. Why not ship this revolutionary into enemy territory and see what kind of chaos unfolds? The strategy was sound, assuming you define sound as handing a grenade to a bear and hoping it mauls your enemies first. So they put Lenin on a sealed train like he was radioactive, and boom, into Petrograd he goes. Fast forward a few riots, speeches, and awkward coalition governments later, and Lenin is large and in charge. Russia pulls out of World War I with all the grace of a drunk uncle leaving a wedding, uninvited and in flames. But peace doesn't follow. No, Russia dives face first into civil war. The Reds, Bolsheviks, versus the Whites, Tsarists, Mensheviks, and random guys with swords. 3 years of gunpowder, famine, and the kind of bureaucratic paranoia that would make the DMV look like Disneyland. Lenin prevails, but at what cost? Well, the economy's in ruins, everyone's starving, and he's been shot by an anarchist. Then, on his deathbed, Lenin, likely coughing up metaphorical blood and metaphorical regret, said one crucial thing: "Hey comrades, don't let Stalin take over." The room nodded solemnly, checked their notes, and then promptly ignored him. And who was in charge of hiring? That's right, Joseph, hug your kids, they might not return. Stalin. Historians still argue whether Lenin was genuinely prescient or just unlucky, but either way, Stalin slides into power like a shadow under the door. Let's talk about Stalin. A man who took the word paranoia and made it his brand. His 5-year plans industrialized the Soviet Union faster than you could say breadline, but also with a side order of purges, show trials and Siberian vacations with no return flights. He collectivized agriculture, which is a poetic way of saying he starved millions of Ukrainians while exporting wheat to look competent. Now some say Stalin had charisma. I say he had a mustache and a talent for vanishing people. Historians still argue whether his cult of personality was genuine admiration or just people pretending really hard to avoid arrest. Artists painted glowing portraits, children sang songs about tractors, and Stalin's image was inescapable, like a badly written pop song on every radio frequency. Meanwhile, the rest of the world tried to pretend this wasn't happening. Europe was licking its wounds from World War I, and the USA had retreated into isolationism, jazz, and economic boom-bust cycles. But while they danced the Charleston, the Soviet Union was becoming a geopolitical enigma, a regime built on ideology, vodka, and enough red banners to carpet the continent. And then came Hitler, that mustachioed maniac, picked a fight with everyone, and invaded the USSR in 19. Stalin, despite purging most of his generals, managed to hold on thanks to the winter, a heroic resistance, and the sheer stubbornness of Soviet industry. The Red Army turned the tide at Stalingrad because naming a city after yourself guarantees motivation, and pushed all the way to Berlin. Now here's the weird part. For a brief, flickering moment, Stalin was an ally of the West. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the new big three, sat at conferences sipping tea and slicing up the globe like it was a Thanksgiving turkey. But behind Stalin's steely gaze, you could see it. He wasn't planning a peace. He was already thinking about borders, about Eastern Europe, about how deep his boots could march before someone said stop. And that someone, dear listener, would turn out to be everyone else. So here you are, standing in the smoky aftermath of World War II, trying to rebuild Europe, while everyone's pretending they still like each other. The war is technically over, but it's like the after party where the host won't leave. And now you're stuck on the couch with Uncle Joe Stalin muttering about fascists and trying to steal the TV remote. For a moment everyone's playing nice. The Allies, America, Britain, the Soviet Union have emerged victorious. Champagne corks have popped, newspapers shout victory, and somewhere someone is probably baking a celebratory casserole. But under all this confetti, something's already rotting. It turns out defeating Hitler was the easy part. Agreeing on what to do next, less so. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences were meant to sort out the post-war mess. You sit in a room with FDR, who looks very tired, Churchill, who looks like he's already halfway into his third cigar, and Stalin, who looks like he's memorized every person in the room's weaknesses. They're deciding the fate of Europe like it's a buffet, and nobody wants the cold peas. The result? Germany gets carved up into occupation zones. Same for Berlin, even though it's deep in the Soviet zone, because logic was optional. America and the UK wanted free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin nodded politely, and then immediately installed communist governance, faster than you could say democratic facade. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, one by one they turned red, not from voting, but from good old-fashioned puppet regimes and a gentle application of tanks. Churchill, never one to underplay drama, declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. It sounded poetic, but the people behind it were more interested in ration cards than metaphors. You, sitting in this historical limbo, realized the alliance was never built to last. It was a convenience marriage, enemies of enemies uniting, until the real honeymoon ended, and they saw each other in the harsh morning light. And oh boy, the morning was brutal. The camaraderie of wartime evaporated. Stalin was increasingly convinced the West was out to encircle and strangle the Soviet Union like a boa constrictor in a Brooks Brothers suit. America, meanwhile, viewed Soviet expansion as the beginning of an ideological plague. If one country went red, wouldn't the rest fall like dominoes? That's the metaphor that would drive US policy for the next 4 decades. It's also the metaphor that would get a lot of other countries' infrastructure blown up. The Cold War didn't start with a bang. It started with a speech, a doctrine, and a whole lot of passive-aggressive letters. President Truman unveiled the Truman Doctrine in 1947, declaring that the US would support any country resisting communism. It sounded noble on paper. In practice, it was a declaration of global chess. Every square mattered, every pawn had potential, and every move risked thermonuclear checkmate. Historians still argue whether Truman genuinely believed in spreading democracy or just really hated sharing the globe with another power. And let's not forget Stalin's response. Nothing says we're friends like staying in Iran after the agreed withdrawal date. Soviet troops lingered like uninvited party guests, and only after a UN glare and some serious pressure did they pack up. Not out of generosity, mind you, just strategic inconvenience. The atmosphere grew chillier. Britain intervened in Greece to stop a communist takeover. In Turkey, Stalin demanded control over strategic waterways, because apparently having the largest land empire wasn't enough. The US responded by sending its biggest battleship on a friendly visit, which is Cold War speak for you touch anything and we'll show you what steel diplomacy looks like. And just like that, the world started choosing sides. NATO formed in 1949, a Western alliance wrapped in shiny promises of mutual defense and shared cable subscriptions. In response, the Soviets grumbled, plotted, and began building their own network of loyal states, an Eastern Bloc where elections happened only if the results were pre-approved. Beneath it all, a quiet, increasingly loud question. Was peace actually possible? Or had the war merely shapeshifted into something colder, stranger, and infinitely more radioactive? Stalin certainly didn't think peace was the goal. In a speech to his inner circle, he declared war with the West inevitable. Inevitable. Not maybe, not if provoked, but inevitable. Like Monday mornings and awkward dinner conversations. Whether he meant it or was simply flexing for his domestic audience remains debated by scholars and therapists alike. Back in the West, suspicions turned into full-blown panic. Americans began seeing communism everywhere. In schools, in unions, in Hollywood scripts. Soviet spies were real, sure, but the paranoia was even more real and way more contagious. And what about Berlin? The awkward roommate situation in the middle of occupied Germany. That's a story for later. Just know, as you tuck yourself a little deeper into this Cold War duvet, that the friendship was over, the honeymoon was burned, buried, and replaced with mutual surveillance and secret files. Oh, and Stalin, he was just getting started. You wake up in Berlin, 1948. Not the fun Berlin with techno clubs and questionable currywurst. No, this Berlin is a shell-shocked mosaic of rubble and broken dreams, divided among the Allies like a dysfunctional pizza. The city is deep in Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the Western Allies, America, Britain and France, still control slices of Berlin like stubborn tenants who refuse to move out of an increasingly hostile landlord's building. Now imagine living in a city where your grocery store is in one zone, your job is in another, and your home sits awkwardly between them, like a divorced couple trying to co-parent a failing economy. That's Berlin in a nutshell, or maybe a landmine. Tensions escalate when the Western Allies decide to introduce a new currency in their sectors, the Deutsche Mark. It's shiny, stable, and not controlled by Stalin. That last part really grinds his gears. To him, this is economic aggression, the capitalistic version of poking someone in the eye with a dollar bill. His response? Fine, no more supply routes for you. And just like that, all land and rail access to West Berlin is cut off. Cue the Berlin blockade, a masterclass in passive-aggressive geopolitics. The Soviets surround West Berlin and wait. They're betting the West will fold, hand over the city, and maybe send a fruit basket. But they miscalculate. Truman doesn't blink. Instead, he pulls out the mother of all logistical flexes, the Berlin airlift. Imagine coordinating thousands of flights every day to deliver food, coal, medicine, and other essentials to a population of over 2 million, all by air. You become the pilot now, flying through narrow air corridors, braving fog, snow, and the occasional Soviet glare. Every 90 seconds, a plane lands, day and night. Milk, flour, even candy for children dropped in tiny parachutes by American pilots, who start getting nicknames like Uncle Wiggly Wings. That's right, one of the largest humanitarian operations in history is also low-key adorable. The Western Allies fly in over 2.3 million tons of supplies during the blockade. Stalin watches, fuming in the Kremlin, possibly stress-eating borscht. He could shoot the planes down, sure, but that would mean war. Real war. And everyone, even Stalin, knows what that would mean, now that nukes are involved. Historians still argue whether the blockade was Stalin's greatest miscalculation or just a badly timed temper tantrum. Either way, after 11 months, he caves. The blockade ends in 1949, and West Berliners emerge blinking into the sunlight, slightly thinner, but defiantly democratic. But the damage is done, the trust is gone. Whatever was left of wartime camaraderie has been trampled by boot prints and propellers. And out of this airlifted defiance comes a new reality. The West consolidates its German sectors into a single state, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The Soviets respond with their own, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. The irony of that name is not lost on anyone with a pulse. Berlin becomes the front porch of the Cold War, a split city inside a split country on a split continent, a place where a single street might divide not just neighborhoods, but entire ideologies. On one side, jazz, blue jeans, and Coca-Cola. On the other, suspicion, queues, and a firm belief that happiness is counter-revolutionary. It becomes the stage for both sides to show off their systems. Western Berlin gets shiny department stores, neon signs, and a few too many ads. East Berlin gets slogans, statues, and a lot of meetings that start with comrade. And for a while, people can still cross the border. East Berliners could visit the West, see the supermarkets, maybe grab a Levi's, and then return home to explain to their government why their groceries were suspiciously delicious. This openness becomes a problem for the East. Too many people are leaving. Doctors, engineers, teachers, anyone who gets a glimpse of life without surveillance, poetry readings, starts planning their exit. It's a brain drain with consequences. The Soviet bloc isn't just losing minds, it's losing faith. Back in Washington, the Truman Doctrine evolves into something bigger, the policy of containment, not destroy communism, just make sure it doesn't spread. Think ideological pest control. And Berlin, with its artificial borders and airlifted resilience, becomes proof that containment can work. And yet, behind all this, there's a lingering sense of dread. Both sides are building weapons, training spies, launching propaganda, and turning a divided city into a symbol of an even more divided world. There's no going back. The Cold War isn't just a metaphor anymore. It's a lived reality, a map redrawn not with ink, but with ideology. So next time someone tells you history is boring, just remind them that, for nearly a year, Berlin was kept alive by airplanes, candy, and sheer political stubbornness. And Stalin, he never forgot that the West didn't blink. Spoiler, he'll try again, just with bricks next time. So here you are, nibbling on your rationed West Berlin chocolate bar, watching the planes disappear into the clouds. You've survived Stalin's little blockade tantrum, and you'd think that would be enough Cold War drama for a while. But no, this is only Act 1. Now comes the economic cage match, Marshall versus Molotov. It sounds like a wrestling event, but it's actually about whose money rebuilds the world and whose ideology rides shotgun. The world is in tatters. Cities flattened, railroads twisted like spaghetti, and people are trading cigarettes for potatoes. In this steaming cauldron of despair, the US takes a look around and thinks, hey, what if we paid everyone to not become communists? Enter the Marshall Plan, named after Secretary of State George Marshall. This isn't just a checkbook, it's a geopolitical strategy in a snappy name. America offers $12 billion in 1947 dollars, which is, enough to buy a small moon, to help rebuild Western Europe. Food, machinery, infrastructure, you name it. But there's a catch. You don't get the money if you're into, say, collectivized farms and newspapers with only one adjective, glorious. Naturally, Western European countries, limping and hungry, say yes please. Factories start humming again, shelves get stocked, and somewhere a Frenchman remembers what wine tastes like when it's not served with a side of rubble. The economic recovery is swift and visible. Streets repaved, homes rebuilt, kids not coughing from dust every 3 seconds. It's a miracle, and it's capitalist flavored. Meanwhile, in the East, Stalin sees this and thinks absolutely not. From his perspective, the Marshall Plan isn't charity, it's imperialism in loafers. The Soviets immediately forbid Eastern Bloc countries from accepting their aid. Czechoslovakia flirts with joining, then remembers their boyfriend owns tanks and politely declines. Historians still argue whether the Marshall Plan was a generous lifeline or a brilliant trap. Was it America spreading goodwill or just capitalism with frosting? You decide. But one thing's certain, Stalin was not amused. So he launches his own alternative, the Molotov Plan. It promises economic assistance to the Eastern Bloc. It's like a discount Marshall Plan, but with more slogans and less food. Then he sets up CumCon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Sounds cozy, right? But it's essentially a Soviet monopoly game, where the bank always wins, and every property is a tractor factory. If you're in the Eastern Bloc, this isn't optional. It's voluntary, like those workplace team-building retreats, where you're encouraged to participate, or mysteriously get fired. Your country signs up, you get Soviet economic coordination, and the privilege of pretending you enjoy it. Also, Cominform gets established just to make sure all those Eastern European leaders remember who's boss. Spoiler, it's not the electorate. The result? An economic Iron Curtain to match the metaphorical one. Western Europe begins to thrive, and the Eastern Bloc does. Less of that. While Paris dazzles, Warsaw tightens its belt, and Berlin again becomes the showcase. West Berlin gets rebuilt with neon lights and grocery aisles. East Berlin gets concrete, slogans, and increasing numbers of people whispering, "Maybe this isn't working." Back in America, everyone is thrilled. Look at those GDP charts. Containment seems to be working. If you make democracy delicious, who would ever want dictatorship? But let's be honest, this isn't just a story of altruism. The US is playing the long game, turning Europe into a market, a buffer, and a billboard for capitalism. And they know exactly what they're doing, because in the Cold War, every bridge rebuilt and every power station restored isn't just infrastructure, it's a message. See, our way works. And Stalin, he's stewing in his Kremlin office, convinced that the West isn't just trying to outgrow him, they're trying to erase him. So he starts clamping down even harder on dissent, purges, propaganda, paranoia. You don't rebuild the Soviet sphere with bricks, you rebuild it with fear. The contrast becomes painfully visible. In the West, governments change, newspapers argue, music evolves. In the East, statues rise, elections don't happen, and somehow jazz becomes a threat to socialism. It's not that one side is perfect. Please don't let the shiny Coke machines fool you. But in the comparison, the East looks greyer by the minute. And yet the Cold War isn't just about Europe. While the Marshall Plan is lifting France's GDP, America is already thinking globally. Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, all future battlegrounds of influence. But first, they have to finish setting the board in Europe. Berlin, again, becomes the key. The Marshall Plan pours in, rebuilding West Berlin with suspicious efficiency. East Berliners, meanwhile, peer across the border and begin to wonder if maybe, just maybe, Uncle Joe doesn't have all the answers. For Stalin, this ideological leakage is unacceptable. Something will have to be done about Berlin. But first, he watches as the West celebrates its economic victory and quietly starts planning his next move. Something higher up. Hint, it involves planes again. But this time, not to bring food, to bring fear. You're now deep in the 1950s, the age of chrome Cadillacs, sock hops, and backyard bomb shelters. The Cold War's heating up without a single shot fired, unless you count propaganda films and overly enthusiastic speeches. The Berlin airlift was yesterday's flex. Today, it's all about alliances. And Truman, never one to leave a drama half-finished, unveils his next trick, NATO. Imagine it. April 1949. 12 nations gather like old friends, with very specific trust issues. The message: if you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. Kind of like a geopolitical group chat, with the option to drop nukes. This is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a shiny new military alliance aimed directly at the Soviet bear. The Cold War just got official letterhead. Stalin doesn't exactly send a fruit basket. In response, he kicks off a full security lockdown in the East and lays the groundwork for his own answer to NATO. Though the Warsaw Pact won't make its grand entrance until 19, but you can already feel it. Europe isn't just divided, it's militarized, and every city bloc has a side. Now let's teleport across the globe to Asia, where the Cold War decides to throw off its trench coat and go hot. Welcome to Korea. It's 1950, and the Korean peninsula is the world's new favourite argument. Post-WW2, it's been sliced at the 38th parallel, north backed by the Soviets, south by the Americans. Each side claims to be the real Korea, and both are led by men who, from a distance, look like your kindly uncle, but are more totalitarian uncle with a secret police. Then North Korea decides it's had enough lines on maps and launches a full-scale invasion of the South. The surprise attack blitzes through, capturing Seoul within days. The West panics, the UN scrambles, and for the first time containment gets muscle. A UN force, mostly American, is sent in. You're Douglas MacArthur now, MacDaddy of the Pacific Theatre, giant ego, even bigger pipe. You land in Incheon, execute a stunning flanking maneuver, push the North back, and start marching northward with dreams of reunification. Then you hit a snag called China, because just as you're high-fiving yourself near the Yalu River, 500,000 Chinese troops stroll in, no invitation needed. They push you right back down the peninsula, like a particularly enthusiastic bouncer. MacArthur says, "Nuke 'em." Truman says, "No," and also you're fired. The war grinds into a stalemate. Trenches, artillery, snow, repeat. Historians still argue whether the Korean War was a contained success or the first domino of a long global migraine. But it's clear the Cold War is no longer cold. It's a simmering cauldron with occasional explosive bubbles. Back in the West, people are buying fallout shelters and comparing blast radii like their baseball stats. Air raid sirens become part of daily life. Duck and cover drills are all the rage in schools, as if hiding under a desk will really save you from a thermonuclear detonation. It's like bringing an umbrella to a lava flow. Cute, but pointless. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is leveling up. In 1949, they drop a little surprise, their own atomic bomb. America's monopoly on mushroom clouds evaporates. Everyone suddenly gets nervous. And then in 1952, America ups the ante with the hydrogen bomb. The Soviets follow suit a year later. The arms race has officially entered the phase known as "Are you kidding me?" There's a new doctrine in town, mutually assured destruction, affectionately nicknamed Mad Day. The idea is simple. If you nuke us, we nuke you, and everyone ends up toast. It's a grim kind of peace, like two people holding grenades and daring each other to sneeze. And yet, despite all this thermonuclear tension, espionage flourishes. The Soviets are collecting Western secrets, like vintage baseball cards, British double agents, American scientists, even some Canadians. Everyone's whispering into briefcases and dropping off microfilms in park benches. The CIA and KGB become global players in their own right, turning world politics into a game of 3D chess, played by men in trench coats. Back home, America isn't just building bombs, it's building ideology. McCarthyism takes hold. Senator Joseph McCarthy points fingers like an over-caffeinated auctioneer, accusing everyone from Hollywood actors to army generals of being closet communists. Careers end, reputations burn, and logic quietly leaves the building. You start to notice something strange. Communist becomes the label for anything slightly inconvenient. Want better wages. Commie. Criticize the government? Definitely a commie. Prefer tea over coffee? You might as well defect already. In the USSR, things aren't much better. Stalin's grip tightens with purges, gulags, and the kind of paranoia usually reserved for horror films. People disappear for telling jokes. Art is censored, and everyone knows that if your neighbour suddenly stops showing up for dinner, you don't ask questions, you just offer to water their plants. By the end of the decade, the world is deeply divided, dangerously armed, and suspicious of literally everything. But no one's backing down, because now it's not just about ideology, it's about pride, survival, and who gets to write the future in bold letters. And remember that Berlin thing. Yeah, we're going back there soon. Spoiler, walls are going to get involved. You open your eyes in a grey, windswept street. On one side, neon lights and department stores. On the other, concrete buildings with watchtowers and whispers. Welcome back to Berlin, where freedom smells faintly of cigarette smoke and schnitzel, and the East smells like fear and reinforced concrete. It's the early 1960s now, and Berlin is about to become the Cold War's most absurdly literal metaphor. Let's rewind just a little. After the Korean mess, both sides are still fuming. America has nukes, the Soviets have nukes, and everyone's clutching theirs like toddlers with toys they're afraid to share. But Berlin is a splinter, a fracture still bleeding beneath the bandage. The city is technically 4 parts, American, British, French, and Soviet. But really, it's 2 cities, a capitalist showroom in the West, and a communist experiment in the East. And people? They're voting with their feet. Thousands of East Berliners are defecting daily. It's hard to convince someone of communism's superiority when they can walk 2 blocks and see a fruit market, a jukebox, and someone casually reading Mad magazine. That's not just embarrassing for the USSR, it's a full-blown PR catastrophe. The East German economy is hemorrhaging workers, especially skilled ones. Think engineers, doctors, mechanics, the people who know how to fix the toilets. So what's a one-party state to do? Well, if you can't make people stay with incentives, build a wall. Literally overnight, East German authorities roll out barbed wire and concrete barriers. August 13th, 1961. Berliners wake up to find their city sliced in 2. Families split, lovers separated. People on the wrong side of the street now need permission to visit their grandma. The Berlin Wall isn't just bricks and guards, it's heartbreak with mortar. And not just any wall. Over time it becomes a multi-layered monstrosity. Inner wall, no man's land, outer wall, searchlights, machine guns, dogs. If you think airport security is invasive, try sprinting across a death strip while someone in a tower debates whether you count as a national threat. Historians still argue whether the wall was a necessary evil or a catastrophic PR move. But whatever it was, it worked. Defections dropped dramatically. East Germany had solved its brain drain problem by essentially bricking in its brains. Meanwhile, in Washington, John F. Kennedy steps into the Oval Office with a winning smile and a Cold War hangover. Young, charismatic, and extremely aware that Khrushchev thinks he's soft. So what does he do? He visits Berlin, of course, stands in front of that concrete beast and delivers his iconic Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which, contrary to popular myth, did not mean I am a jelly donut. No, it meant I stand with this city, and by extension, against you, Soviet oppression. And the people loved it. Kennedy becomes a folk hero in Berlin. East Germans press their ears against the wall, straining to hear his words through the static and the propaganda. In the eyes of the world, the wall becomes a symbol not of East German strength, but of Soviet fear. But the tension isn't done yet. That same year, at a checkpoint, aptly named Charlie, American and Soviet tanks face off nose to nose. Guns loaded, engines rumbling. All it takes is one itchy trigger finger, and we're doing nuclear charades. For 16 agonizing hours, the world holds its breath. Then, miraculously, reason wins. Kennedy and Khrushchev back off, inch by inch. It's the diplomatic equivalent of both sides stepping away from a cliff, one shoelace at a time. Still, no one feels particularly secure. In fact, if the Cold War had a relationship status, it would be it's complicated. So the Americans begin focusing on tech. Enter the U-2 spy planes, soaring over Soviet territory, snapping photos like paranoid hawks, until one is shot down in 1960, and suddenly the we totally trust each other facade cracks again. The real shock comes from above, not with a bang, but a beep. 1957, the Soviets launch Sputnik, the first man-made satellite to orbit Earth. It doesn't do much, just orbits and beeps. but psychologically, it detonates in the West. If the Soviets can launch satellites, could they also launch bombs over the pole? Cue panic. America scrambles. NASA is born. Schools revamp their science curricula overnight. And in 1961, the Soviets up the ante again. Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space. The US counters with Alan Shepard, then John Glenn. It's no longer about ideologies. It's about the moon, baby. But back in Berlin, things remain deeply grounded in grim reality. The wall stands tall, dividing not just a city, but two visions of the future. On one side, jeans, jazz, and Coca-Cola. On the other, rations, rallies, and red stars. Still, life goes on. People adapt, as humans do. Some East Berliners risk everything to escape, by tunnels, hot air balloons, or in one case, a homemade zip line. Others stay, resigned or resolved. And West Berlin, it becomes a glowing capitalist island in a grey sea, a literal showcase city for NATO's ideological tourism. And you, Cold War wanderer, begin to feel the grind of it all. No explosions, no great battles, just pressure, constant humming, tightening pressure. The world isn't at war, but it's never at peace either. It's like holding your breath for decades. And as you close your eyes tonight in a divided city, behind a concrete wall, built not to keep invaders out, but its own citizens in, you can't help but wonder how long can anyone live like this. The 1960s roll on, a decade dripping in revolution, lava lamps, and way too many CIA-backed coups. You're lounging in your metaphorical armchair, feet up, TV humming, and then the screen glitches. A serious-looking anchor says words that will rattle the nerves of every American in a 500-mile radius. Missiles in Cuba. Yep, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That delightful little event when the world danced on the edge of Armageddon in October 1962 because two superpowers decided to play nuclear chicken in the Caribbean. But how did we even get here? Let's rewind to the tropics. Cuba, pre-1959, is basically America's bachelor party destination, casinos, cigars, and a corrupt regime that's more loyal to US business interests than to its own people. Enter Fidel Castro, bearded, brooding, and slightly allergic to capitalism. He and Che Guevara boot the US-friendly Batista and take over Havana. Nationalizations follow. Land reform. Foreign corporations kicked out like frat boys who broke a lamp. Washington is not amused. The CIA does what it does best, trains a group of exiled Cubans, hands them some guns, and says, "Go fix this." Thus begins the Bay of Pigs invasion, which is as embarrassing as it sounds. The plan is half-baked. Support is withdrawn last minute, and within days Castro's forces mop the floor with the invaders. It's not just a loss, it's a humiliating loss. Kennedy eats the blame but resolves, never again, except the Soviets see the whole mess as an opportunity wrapped in a palm leaf. Khrushchev thinks, what if we put our missiles in Cuba, close to America's coastline, super threatening, and a great way to level the playing field, since they've got missiles in Turkey pointed at us. So construction begins. Secretly, except it's the 60s and America has spy planes everywhere. On October 14th, a U-2 aircraft photographs the missile sites under construction. Kennedy is shown the images. The Joint Chiefs want airstrikes. The CIA wants invasions. Everyone wants to do something. But JFK, cool, measured, occasionally sunburned, opts for a blockade. No, sorry, a quarantine, because apparently blockading a sovereign country is only bad if you call it that. Ships are rerouted, tensions rise. You can almost hear the missiles being armed in underground silos. DEFCON 2 is declared the closest America has ever been to full-scale nuclear war. Submarines are lurking, bombers are in the air, diplomats are biting their nails into powder. And then amid the chess match of ultimatums and secret back channels, the Soviets blink. Khrushchev writes a frantic letter, then a second one that's way more aggressive. Kennedy chooses to respond to the first, the polite one, and offers a secret deal. Remove the missiles from Cuba, and the US will, very quietly, remove theirs from Turkey. It works. The missiles are pulled. The world exhales. And for just a moment, it feels like diplomacy isn't a complete joke. Historians still argue whether Khrushchev came out of it, weakened or wiser. But what's clear is this: both sides realized they'd gone way too far. The direct hotline between Washington and Moscow is established, so next time they can yell at each other instantly instead of mailing angry letters like pen pals with nuclear arsenals. But peace? Oh no, not quite. In the aftermath, Kennedy's approval ratings soar. Khrushchev's start to nosedive, and Cuba digs in as the hemisphere's one communist outpost. Basically the goth teenager in a family of sunshine-loving capitalists. Castro turns to the USSR like a child clinging to an emotionally distant parent. And the embargo? That thing is still going on as of, well, your next vacation. Meanwhile, the arms race doesn't slow, it accelerates. If there's one lesson the superpowers take from the crisis, it's this: have more bombs. And if those bombs are more powerful, even better. Enter the hydrogen bomb again, and the even spicier innovations like MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles. Yes, the US and USSR now have missiles that split mid-air and hit multiple cities at once, because apparently destroying just one city at a time is for amateurs. Then there's MRD, mutually assured destruction. You remember that charming doctrine, right? If either side launches nukes, everyone dies. Cities vanish, skies turn black, crops fail, and humans probably start drawing cave art again. It's grim, sure, but paradoxically, it keeps the peace. The logic is, I won't punch you if it means my own house explodes too. Still, the Cold War's true heat isn't in Moscow or DC anymore. It's in the proxy wars. Vietnam is brewing. Africa is becoming a chessboard. The Middle East is about to catch fire. The Cold War isn't just about nuclear standoffs. It's about which ideology gets to puppet which nation. Back home in the US, Kennedy is a Cold War rock star until he isn't. November 1963. Dallas. A motorcade and a bullet. Suddenly the idealistic torch passes to Lyndon B. Johnson, who inherits both the Oval Office and a boiling pot of communism fears, civil unrest, and a Southeast Asian quagmire. But before Vietnam gets its own tragic spotlight, something else is spreading. The awareness that maybe, just maybe, this whole global annihilation idea is a bad look. Treaties start being tossed around, talks of arms limitations, and slowly, diplomatically, the Cold War gets a vocabulary of its own, one that includes not blowing each other up. And yet, despite everything, despite walls, bombs, invasions, and brinkmanship, the world keeps spinning. Children go to school, people fall in love. Some guy still forgets to take the trash out, because even in a world bristling with weapons, life insists on continuing. But if you thought the Cuban Missile Crisis was the end of the scariest chapter, wait till the name hits the fan. You feel the jungle heat seep into your skin, humid, sticky, and teeming with unseen tension. The year is 1965, and you, my sleep-deprived time traveller, have found yourself in the thick, leafy heart of the Cold War's most disastrous, we-meant-well endeavour, Vietnam. Welcome to a proxy war, where the maps lie, the enemies vanish, and the only clear victory is in who can deny losing the longest. It didn't begin here, of course. No Cold War conflict ever really starts where it explodes. After World War II, Vietnam was split at the 17th parallel. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and his communist crew. In the south, an anti-communist government propped up by the West, run by a man who made autocracy look like a fashion statement. Naturally, the United States took one look and thought, yep, this will definitely not backfire. The goal? Prevent the so-called domino effect. If Vietnam fell to communism, the logic went, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and eventually your local burger joint would be next. Okay, maybe not the burger joint, but fear made things elastic. So America sent advisors, then support, then more advisors, and before you know it, there were 500,000 US troops in country, most of whom had no idea where they were or why they were being shot at by farmers with AKs who disappeared into tunnels the moment you blinked. Historians still argue whether America ever really understood what was happening in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, these weren't just communists, they were nationalists. They weren't trying to install Soviet policies, they were trying to end centuries of foreign rule. France, Japan, France again, and now America. This wasn't chess, it was more like a wasp nest. You poke it, and suddenly everyone's stung. So the US tried to bomb the wasps. Operation Rolling Thunder was its name, and if it sounds like a Marvel villain, you're not far off. For years, B-52 bombers carpeted jungles, hills, villages, everywhere except where the enemy actually was. Napalm rained down, Agent Orange was sprayed with generous abandon, and guerrilla tactics meant US soldiers never knew if that smiling rice farmer was going to hand them tea or a grenade. Meanwhile, back home, things were boiling. Televisions brought the war into living rooms. Americans watched in real time as young men returned in caskets or limped back, broken in ways no parade could mend. And those who didn't return, they sent letters, footage, or sometimes nothing at all. Protests erupted. Students at Kent State were gunned down during an anti-war rally. The government looked less like a saviour and more like a shell-shocked giant staggering through mud. Suddenly, being anti-war wasn't treasonous. It was mainstream. And yet the war dragged on. Presidents changed. Policies shifted. But the jungle didn't care. The Viet Cong used tunnels, traps, propaganda, and time. Lots and lots of time. The US had firepower. The North had patience. You can't airstrike willpower. One mainstream historical fact. The Tet Offensive in 1968. A massive surprise attack by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces across South Vietnam shocked the American public. Militarily, it was repelled. Psychologically, it was devastating. It proved the enemy was far from broken, and that victory, if it existed at all, was nowhere in sight. And here's a quirky bit. The US Army spent millions developing a bomb that emitted a smell, yes, a smell, intended to mimic the scent of North Vietnamese soldiers, hoping to use dogs to track them. Turns out, jungle warfare is not particularly smell sensitive. By the early 70s, America had had enough. Nixon, that famously honest fellow, began Vietnamization, a fancy way of saying, let's make this their problem. US troops were pulled out gradually. Peace talks in Paris dragged on longer than your grandma's stories about the 1940s, and eventually, in 1973, the last American combat troops left Vietnam. 2 years later, Saigon fell. North Vietnamese tanks rolled in. The South crumbled. Helicopters lifted the last evacuees from the US Embassy rooftop. And just like that, America's longest war until Afghanistan was over, except for the people who lived through it. For them, it never really ended. But this isn't just a tale of American loss. The Cold War spread its proxy fingerprints across the globe during this time. Angola, civil war with Soviet and Cuban support on one side, South Africans and the CIA on the other. Nicaragua, Sandinistas and Contras played tug-of-war while the Reagan administration got creative with funding. Chile, the CIA backed a coup that put a dictator in power for decades. The Middle East, US and Soviet interests turned every dust-up into a geopolitical tinderbox. If the Cold War had a genre, it would be geopolitical horror anthology. Every country a new episode, every episode darker than the last. Yet even here, as you sit by the campfire of memory in Vietnam's smouldering jungles, something stirs. The idea that maybe the Cold War isn't going to end in one big bang, but rather in exhaustion. The USSR is pouring money into these skirmishes like water into sand. America is bleeding young lives for strategic ambiguity. Ideologies aside, there's a creeping sense on both sides that this might not be sustainable. Still, no one blinks first, because blinking is weakness, and weakness in a bipolar world is suicide. So the Cold War marches on. But its boots are dragging now, its soldiers are tired, and the jungle remains, as always, indifferent. You're now drifting through the early 1970s, floating between nuclear nightmares and disco dreams. You've just left behind the murky chaos of Vietnam, but the Cold War, my exhausted explorer, is nowhere near done with you. It's shedding its camouflage and sliding into its next phase, détente, which, if you're unfamiliar, is French for let's pretend to be nice while still pointing a loaded gun under the table. Yes, détente. That delicate little pause button the superpowers hit when they realized that constantly flirting with thermonuclear disaster was perhaps a poor long-term strategy. But don't confuse détente with peace. No one hugged it out. They just decided to argue quietly through treaties, summits, and way too many awkward photo ops between men who'd rather be anywhere else. Let's start with Nixon, that famously complex president with a voice like a rusted saxophone and a moral compass that pointed due whatever's most convenient. Nixon, believe it or not, becomes a pioneer of Cold War diplomacy. Why? Because he knew the United States needed to breathe, needed to stop hemorrhaging money and morale in distant jungles, and bonus points, he liked looking tough in a suit next to communists. In 1972, Nixon makes headlines by visiting two places Americans weren't exactly sending postcards from, China and the Soviet Union. That's right, first he plays ping-pong with Mao Zedong's regime. Seriously, ping-pong diplomacy is a real term. Then he hops over to Moscow for caviar and cautious handshakes with Leonid Brezhnev, the man whose eyebrows needed their own security clearance. They sit down, they smile, they sign things. One of those things is SALT-I, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It sounds impressive, and to be fair, it does limit the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles. But, and here's where things get wonderfully Cold War-ish, it doesn't stop either side from building newer, more exciting ways to deliver annihilation. Because who wants just one missile when you can have MIRVs, missiles with multiple warheads that scatter like deadly confetti? Still, for a while, détente works. The rhetoric softens. Hotlines hum quietly. Summits sprout like mushrooms. The world, watching from the sidelines, dares to exhale a little. In Europe, they even start discussing human rights, which for the Soviet bloc is a bit like talking about veganism at a barbecue. But they signed the Helsinki Accords in 1975 anyway, promising to respect borders, promote cooperation, and nod politely when someone brings up civil liberties. Historians still argue whether détente was a genuine thaw or just political theatre. But here's a quirky tidbit for your pillow. During Nixon's Moscow visit, he gave Brezhnev a Lincoln Continental as a gift. Brezhnev loved cars, collected them obsessively, and this one? He drove it recklessly through the Kremlin grounds until his security detail begged him to stop. Now that's diplomacy, chrome and horsepower. But while the suits were shaking hands, the shadows weren't resting. Intelligence agencies kept busy. Spies still swapped secrets like baseball cards. Espionage technology blossomed. Satellites, bugged typewriters, briefcases with cameras, pigeons with tiny microphones. No joke. Détente didn't kill the Cold War. It just dressed it in a nicer suit. Back home, though, Nixon's suit was unraveling. You remember Watergate, yes? That charming episode where the president's men broke into Democratic offices, lied about it, lied again, and then lied about the lying. Eventually, Nixon waved goodbye in 1974, grumbling all the way to the helicopter. He was replaced by Gerald Ford, a man whose presidency is mostly remembered for him falling downstairs and pardoning Nixon faster than you can say political blowback. Ford tried to keep détente alive, even signing another SALT agreement in Vienna, where Brezhnev tried to kiss him. Ford flinched. The moment was immortalized. Détente now had an awkward prom photo to remember it by. But beneath the surface, trouble brewed. The Soviets weren't reforming. Their economy was stagnating, their citizens were grumbling, and their military kept expanding. They were funneling money into regimes across Africa and Latin America, arming leftist rebels in Angola, propping up dictators in Ethiopia, and engaging in a geopolitical tug-of-war so convoluted it made risk look like tic-tac-toe. Meanwhile, America was having a crisis of confidence. Inflation soared, gas lines stretched for blocks. The presidency felt cursed, and into this storm walked Jimmy Carter, mild-mannered, peanut-farming, cardigan-wearing Jimmy. He came in preaching human rights, transparency, and decency. Admirable traits, sure, but not exactly what the Cold War demanded in a heavyweight. Still, Carter tried. He negotiated treaties. He grinned through summits. He signed SALT II in 1979, though Congress never ratified it. He even leaned into nuclear disarmament, until the Soviets invaded Afghanistan later that year, and basically torched the détente like a forgotten campfire. Ah yes, Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. The USSR decided it needed to stabilize its southern neighbor, so it invaded with tanks, troops, and the usual "we'll be out by Christmas" optimism. Spoiler, they would not be out by Christmas. This invasion marks the end of Détente's dreamy era. The US boycotts the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The Soviets continue their military adventures, and suddenly everyone's back to growling across the table again. The Cold War is awake, caffeinated, and ready to rumble. But before we leave the 70s behind, a final observation. This was the decade where both sides realized they could no longer afford the Cold War. Not financially, not morally. The public was weary. The leaders, cautious. The arms piled up, sure, but so did the doubts. Détente was a band-aid over a bullet wound, but at least it showed the world that even the fiercest enemies could pause, breathe, and pretend to be sane for a moment. And if pretending was the best the Cold War could do, well, that was still better than the alternative. You awaken now in the shadow of a cowboy hat, not a literal one, though that wouldn't be far off. The 1980s are here, and with them comes the Cold War's last great flare-up before its inevitable unraveling. The man of the hour is Ronald Reagan, Hollywood actor turned president, whose approach to the Cold War can be summarized thusly: speak loudly and build a missile defense system in space. Yes, my travel-weary friend. Welcome to the era of swaggering speeches, sky-high military budgets, and nuclear nerves fraying like the hem of a cheap polyester suit. If détente was a polite handshake, Reaganism is a booming laugh with one hand on the trigger. Reagan comes into office in 1981 with a clear mission. No more tiptoeing around the Soviets. No more pretending that nuclear parity is peace. His rhetoric is aggressive, his vision stark. The USSR, an evil empire. His goal, not coexistence, victory. And to achieve it, he opens the wallet. Defense spending skyrockets. There's the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, a plan to shoot down nuclear missiles from space with lasers. Lasers. Historians still argue whether this was technological optimism or just a really expensive bluff. Critics scoffed. The Pentagon blinked. The Soviets panicked. Either way, it spooked everyone into thinking Reagan had watched too many science fiction movies. But beneath the Hollywood theatrics was a shrewd calculation. Reagan knew the USSR was already stretched thin. Their economy wheezed like an asthmatic accordion. Their military was eating up resources. Their people queued for bread, while the Kremlin bankrolled foreign revolutions. If he could crank up the pressure just a bit more, make them think the US had superior tech, maybe, just maybe, he could force them to negotiate from a place of desperation. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, it's a gerontocracy roulette. Brezhnev dies in 19... He's replaced by Yuri Andropov, who dies in 19... Then comes Konstantin Chernenko, who dies in 19... It's like the Soviet Union is trying to win a Cold War with corpses. The leadership is old, grey and fossilizing in real time. And then finally, someone different arrives. Mikhail Gorbachev. young, energetic by Soviet standards, and bolding in a way that inspired trust. He wasn't just a fresh face, he was a reformer with a vocabulary that made hardliners sweat. His two buzzwords, glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Gorbachev understood that the USSR couldn't compete with the West militarily and economically. Something had to give. So he began loosening the grip. He allowed more freedom of speech. He cut back on censorship. He acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, the Soviet system wasn't perfect. Now that may sound tame to your freedom-saturated ears, but for the Soviet people, it was like opening the curtains on a sun they'd forgotten existed. Still, not everyone welcomed the light. Within the Soviet bureaucracy, there was resistance. The KGB grumbled. Party officials whispered. Reforms, they feared, were the beginning of the end. They weren't wrong. But let's pause for a moment to appreciate this quirky historical detail. Gorbachev was such a novelty in the West that he became a pop culture icon. He appeared on magazine covers, inspired songs, and even starred in Pizza Hut commercials post-collapse. Yes, really, from the Politburo to pepperoni. Anyway, Gorbachev and Reagan meet, not once, not twice, but 5 times over the course of Reagan's presidency. And while the early meetings are frosty, one even nearly collapses over Star Wars, their relationship evolves. Reagan, it turns out, isn't just an actor. He listens, he adapts, and by the end of his presidency, he's working with Gorbachev, not just against him. In 1987, they signed the INF Treaty, the first agreement to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. This wasn't just symbolic. Thousands of missiles were destroyed, entire launch sites dismantled. Arms control, at last, wasn't a theoretical debate, it had teeth. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is spiraling. Gorbachev's reforms open the floodgates. The Eastern Bloc is watching carefully, and they don't like what they see at home. They like what they see abroad. Western music, Western clothes, Western food. Capitalism suddenly doesn't seem so monstrous. And communism, well, it's starting to look like a dusty museum exhibit. But Gorbachev's balancing act is precarious. At home, hardliners want to reverse reforms. Abroad, satellite states are getting restless. And Reagan? He's not done yet. His final speech in Berlin, delivered with his usual cinematic flair, includes the line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." A challenge, yes, but also a prophecy. Historians still debate how much Reagan's pressure truly influenced the collapse of the USSR. Was it his arms race, his rhetoric, his charm, or was the Soviet system already so rotten that one more push was all it took? The answer, like most Cold War narratives, depends on who you ask and how much sleep you've had. Regardless, by the late 80s, something's changing. The Cold War no longer feels inevitable. There's a strange quiet, not peace exactly, but not the old panic either. People stop ducking under desks, civil defense drills fade, and slowly the world begins to wonder, could this be the beginning of the end? And you, gentle listener, floating here on the cusp of history, are about to witness the final act. But don't drift off just yet. The fall is coming, and walls, as we'll see, make a very satisfying noise when they crumble. The year is 1989. The winds outside your dream world blow with a new current, a strange, exhilarating gust that smells suspiciously like change all across Eastern Europe. People are waking up not just from sleep, but from 40 years of silence. The Cold War's iron grip is rusting, and the walls, literal and metaphorical, are about to come tumbling down. You're strolling now through East Berlin, where life feels like a looped recording. Grey buildings, grey clothes, grey opinions. But under this dull film, colour is starting to bleed through. In Hungary, border fences to Austria are being dismantled. In Poland, the Solidarity movement is winning elections. In Czechoslovakia, students are gathering, chanting softly at first. It's no longer just whispers in kitchens, it's a roar in the streets. And it all leads back to that cracked but iconic cement scar, dividing Berlin. For decades, the Berlin Wall had stood not just as a physical barrier, but as the most photographable metaphor in modern history. It sliced the city in half, separating ideologies, families, lovers, dreams. And now East Germans are beginning to realize something profound. The guards look tired, the slogans feel hollow, the fear no longer tastes the same. The people are ready, but is the system? In October 1989, Erich Honecker, the old-school, hardline leader of East Germany, gives a speech promising that the wall will stand for another 100 years. Historians still argue whether this was delusion or denial. But just weeks later, Honecker is forced out of power by his own party. The revolution, it turns out, prefers irony. You, dear listener, walk among the swelling crowds in Leipzig. The Monday demonstrations are growing. First hundreds, then thousands, then hundreds of thousands. People hold candles. They chant, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. It's peaceful, and it's unstoppable. On November 9, 1989, a hapless East German bureaucrat, Günther Schabowski, stumbles through a press conference. He's asked about the new travel regulations. He shuffles some papers, looks confused, and mutters that the border is open. As far as I know, effective immediately. He wasn't supposed to say that, but he does, and history rolls forward. That night, thousands of Berliners surge toward the checkpoints. The guards, confused and outnumbered, make a choice. Open the gates. No orders, no bloodshed, just doors flung wide. And just like that, the Berlin Wall ceases to matter. People climb it, dance on it, chip away at it with hammers and chisels. Some cry, some laugh, some just stand there, stunned. East meets West, with a kiss, a cheer, a cautious hope. Now pause for a moment and let your mind linger there. Feel the concrete under your fingers, the cold night air on your skin, the camera flashes catching tears on unfamiliar faces. History rarely offers such a clean cinematic release, but this is one of those rare exceptions. And yet, while Berlin celebrates, other dominoes are tilting. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution unfolds. With graceful determination, students lead the way, joined by intellectuals, artists, even former dissidents like Václav Havel. Within weeks, the Communist Party cedes power. There are no tanks, just chance and civic stubbornness. Havel, once imprisoned for his words, becomes president because of his words. In Bulgaria, the old leader Todor Zhivkov is ousted, and political reform follows. Even Romania, ever the outlier, cannot resist the wave. There the story turns grim. Nicolae Ceausescu, a man with delusions of grandeur and a cult of personality so thick you could spread it on toast, tries to crush protests in Timisoara. Instead, he sparks a nationwide uprising. Within days, he's arrested, tried, and executed on television with his wife. A grim finale for a dictator who once fancied himself eternal. Historians still debate whether these revolutions succeeded because of grassroots will or because Gorbachev gave them space. Likely both. Gorbachev, unlike his predecessors, doesn't send tanks. He doesn't issue ultimatums. He watches, sometimes nervously, but always from the sidelines. To him, the Eastern Bloc isn't a possession, it's a burden, and he's finally letting go. But not everyone agrees. Back in the Kremlin, hardliners scowl. The Soviet Union itself is groaning under the weight of its own reforms. Nationalist movements stir in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Their people wave forbidden flags, sing banned songs. In Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, similar stories. The USSR, it turns out, is not so united after all. And you, my time-lost dreamer, are now wandering through a world turning inside out. For decades, East and West had glared at each other across a chasm. Now the chasm is closing. Slowly, unevenly, but closing. Yet this is not a fairy tale. Not everyone is cheering. Not every change is painless. For every wall that falls, There's confusion, fear, economic chaos, jobs lost, identities questioned. Many in the East don't know what democracy means, only that it promises more than what they had, and promises, as we know, can be slippery things. Still, in that moment, in late 1989, the Cold War seems to exhale. It isn't over yet, but it's leaning that way. The nuclear sirens are quiet. The spies are bored. The ideology that once fueled entire armies now fuels conversations. And Berlin, that bruised and battered city, stands reunited not just by politics, but by joy. You watch as old men toast with strangers, children crawl through the breach in the wall, and someone plays Beethoven from a boombox, balanced on concrete rubble. The world hasn't been fixed, but for the first time in a long while, it feels possible. And that feeling, that crack of light breaking through a Cold War dawn, will carry us into what comes next. Now the wind shifts again, subtle but decisive, carrying you eastward into the very heart of the disintegrating empire. The Soviet Union, once the granite core of global communism, is starting to feel more like a half-deflated balloon tied loosely to a rusted satellite dish. As you float into the year 1990, the Cold War hasn't just shifted, it's unraveling. The hammer and sickle still hang above Moscow, sure, but the people below are not looking up anymore. They're staring forward, or backward, or most dangerously for the state around. They're questioning things that were once too dangerous to question out loud. Why is there no food on the shelves? Why are our leaders ancient and paranoid? Why, for the love of Lenin, is our toothpaste still in metal tubes that explode if you squeeze too hard? In this new atmosphere of glasnost, everyone is suddenly a critic. Gorbachev had opened the floodgates, perhaps hoping for a gentle stream of reform. What he got was a tidal wave. And then, as if summoned by chaos itself, enter Boris Yeltsin, burly, bullish, charismatic, in a way that suggests he's about 2 vodka shots away from dancing on a tank. Yeltsin doesn't just want reforms, he wants sovereignty, specifically for Russia. Yes, you heard right, the Russian Republic, the biggest part of the Soviet Union, is now asserting its independence from the Soviet Union. You rub your temples. It's like watching someone declare independence from themselves. Historians still argue whether Yeltsin was saving Russia or simply grabbing power before the whole structure collapsed on its own. What's clear is that Gorbachev, once the man of the moment, is suddenly playing catch-up. He's being outmaneuvered by regional leaders, nationalist movements, and the slow, creeping realization that the Soviet economy is, well, toast. You walk through the streets of Vilnius, where Lithuanians march, with their flag once illegal, now defiantly airborne. Latvia and Estonia follow. Ukraine wavers, then demands autonomy. Georgia surges forward. The Caucasus roils with unrest. One by one, the Soviet republics begin to drift, not away from the earth, but from Moscow's gravity. Meanwhile, back in the Russian capital, there's a coup brewing. It's August 1991. Hardline communists, fed up with Gorbachev's reforms and Yeltsin's rising influence, attempt to seize power. Tanks roll into the streets. Gorbachev is placed under house arrest in Crimea. The air thickens. The Cold War, it seems, wants one last gasp of drama. But what the coup plotters didn't expect was the power of a good balcony speech. Yeltsin, in perhaps his most cinematic moment, climbs onto a tank outside the Russian Parliament building, known as the White House, and addresses the crowd. His voice is hoarse but firm. His stance is wobbly but unyielding. It is part political theatre, part civic defiance. The people cheer, the soldiers blink, and the coup collapses like a soufflé under a heat lamp. Gorbachev returns to Moscow days later, but something's changed. He's technically still in charge, but symbolically not anymore. The real power now lies with Yeltsin, and Yeltsin doesn't want to save the Soviet Union. He wants to bury it. And so in December 1991, without so much as a dramatic overture, the end arrives. Leaders of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus, Meet in a forest, sign some papers, and declare the USSR officially dissolved. Gorbachev resigns. The hammer and sickle is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. And you, yes, you are standing in the snow, watching it fall. Not the snow, though it is falling too soft and silent, but the great, ponderous bulk of a superpower that defined the 20th century. It does not explode. It does not even creak. It simply evaporates. The Cold War is over. Or is it? See, here's the thing. Historians still debate when the Cold War truly ended. Was it the fall of the Berlin Wall, the signing of the INF Treaty, the collapse of the USSR, or did it just shape-shift, morphing into something colder, subtler, more tangled? Economic chess matches, cyber wars, cultural infiltration. One could argue we've simply entered a quieter sequel. But for now, for this moment, it really does feel over. In the West, people rejoice. They declare democracy the victor, capitalism the reigning champion. Francis Fukuyama, a political theorist with a flair for optimism, even declares the end of history. Spoiler, history laughs and says, "Hold my beer." And in the East, jubilation, yes, but also confusion. The sudden vacuum of ideology, authority, structure. It's intoxicating, but disorienting. Citizens swap marks for Marlboros, queues for chaos, surveillance for uncertainty. For many, freedom tastes like instant noodles and economic freefall. The 1990s will be messy. Russia will wobble between reform and corruption. Former Soviet states will forge new identities, some democratic, some less so. NATO will expand, capitalism will go global, and the old lines of the Cold War will dissolve, only to reappear decades later under different names. But that's for another dream. For now, as snow swells around your imagined self, let's take a breath. The Cold War, with its doctrines and dogmas, its paranoia and power plays, its proxy wars and peace summits, it is behind you, not gone, but transformed. And somewhere in the distance, perhaps faintly, perhaps not, you hear a new sound, not boots, not bombs, but the ringing of old truths cracking open. Sleep on that? You drift now through the early 1990s, that soft and surreal decade where everything seemed possible, yet nothing made quite enough sense. The Cold War was declared over, on paper, in speeches, in headlines with triumphant fonts. But as your dream self floats above the fresh ruins of a bipolar world, you begin to sense that endings are never so clean. Some Cold Wars, you learn, leave echoes. In Russia the air tastes different. It's thinner, freer, but also sharper, like breathing in through your teeth after a dentist's drill. The people had imagined democracy would arrive like a sleek Western car, glossy, fast, reliable. Instead, it shudders in like a used Lada with one working headlight and a radio stuck on static. The Soviet structure had crumbled, but nothing sturdy had yet replaced it. You follow Boris Yeltsin as he tries to steer the Russian Federation into capitalism at the speed of light. Western advisors rush in with briefcases full of economic theory and zero context. Price controls are lifted. State industries are privatized. Which sounds great until you realize that privatization in this context means a handful of guys with shady connections and old KGB friends now own all the oil, steel, and media. They become known as oligarchs, which is Greek for congratulations. Your communism has been replaced with a Bond villain consortium. Meanwhile, everyday Russians find themselves plunged into a new kind of war, not with America, but with poverty, crime, and confusion. One day they're standing in line for government cheese. The next, they're wondering how much their apartment is worth on this wild new thing called a market. Spoiler, not much, unless it's near a Western hotel. Historians still argue whether Yeltsin's shock therapy was a noble but bungled attempt at transition, or a reckless dive off a cliff with a parachute made of Western TED Talks. What's clear is that by 1993, things aren't going smoothly. Inflation eats through savings like fire through old wallpaper. The ruble loses value. Pensions vanish. The nostalgia for order begins to creep in. Ironic, given that just a few years ago, people were risking their lives to escape that very order. And outside of Russia, the ripples continue. In the United States, the so-called peace dividend, promised by Cold War victory, starts to pay out in cautious optimism. Military spending is trimmed, diplomatic ties are renewed. NATO, however, stays and begins to expand eastward. This expansion, welcomed by many former Soviet satellites, is seen by others, Russia, as a broken promise wrapped in a handshake. America steps boldly into its new unipolar moment. There are think pieces with titles like The End of History and Why Democracy Always Wins. The future seems bright if you squint past Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. The Cold War might be over, but its leftovers are being reheated in regional conflicts, proxy aftershocks, and international awkwardness. In Ukraine, independence brings identity, but also new fault lines. Crimea, with its Russian majority population, quietly simmers. In the Caucasus, ancient tensions ignite again. Armenia and Azerbaijan resume a deadly spat over Nagorno-Karabakh. Chechnya, restless under Russian control, begins to eye secession, leading to a war that's as brutal as it is underreported. Even Germany, now reunited, finds itself navigating the awkward adolescence of integration. East meets West in boardrooms and unemployment lines. Turns out freedom is wonderful, but it doesn't pay the bills, fix the plumbing, or explain why Westerners are so obsessed with microwavable curry. And you, floating through these awkward post-Cold War days, sense something uncomfortable. For all its danger and dread, the Cold War had clarity. 2 sides, 1 line. Now everything's up for debate. Culture too begins to blur and blend. Russian youth, once arrested for listening to bootleg Beatles tapes, now blast Nirvana. McDonald's opens in Moscow to crowds so large they seem to be protesting starvation with Big Macs. Western capitalism becomes not just an economic force, but a cultural one. Jeans, soda, sitcoms, they flood the East like cheerful invaders in a Pepsi-coloured tank. But beneath the surface, resistance bubbles, not in the form of armies this time, but in ideas, nationalism, religious identity, resentment of the West's smugness. You see it in the graffiti on walls, in the late-night radio rants, in the slow, steady tightening of government control in some of the newly free nations. And in the West, victory brings boredom, or at least distraction. Without the threat of mutual annihilation looming, domestic issues return to center stage. America turns inward. It debates healthcare, budgets, and reality TV. Politicians promise a bridge to the 21st century. No one notices that the bridge is wobbling. Meanwhile, the weapons are still here. Thousands of nuclear warheads remain, mostly in silos, mostly quiet. Arms control treaties are signed, but some are also ignored or shredded. The security dilemma didn't end. It just put on new clothes and updated its LinkedIn profile. You realize now that the Cold War was less an event and more a state of being. Its traces linger in defense budgets, in alliance maps, in the language of diplomacy. Trust but verify becomes a bumper sticker for every negotiation. Axis of evil becomes a rebooted plotline. And so here you are, my dreaming listener, suspended between eras. You're watching a world try to reorient itself after a 40-year bipolar hangover. Some nations will thrive, others will stumble, and some will look back, squinting, wondering if maybe, just maybe, that old Cold War had at least one thing going for it, predictability. But that thought can wait until morning. You glide now into the late 1990s, that shimmering moment when optimism had slicked its hair back, put on a leather jacket, and convinced itself it was in charge. You're hovering above Washington, London, Paris, and a dozen other Western capitals, where leaders speak confidently about a new world order. And in a sense they're right. The Cold War curtain has fallen. The audience has applauded, and someone has turned on the house lights. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice there's still movement behind the stage. Let's start with NATO, shall we? During the Cold War, it was the West's military promise ring. You mess with one, you mess with all. But after 1991, with its supposed raison d'etre gone, you might expect it to fade politely into retirement, maybe take up gardening. Nope, instead, it expands. In 1999, NATO welcomes 3 new members: Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. 3 countries that had once lived behind the Iron Curtain and now couldn't join the West fast enough. From their perspective, it was like finally moving out of your abusive ex's basement and buying your own apartment with a fancy security system. From Russia's perspective, it looked like the ex was installing cameras outside your new place and waving. Historians still argue whether NATO expansion was a necessary reassurance or a provocative misstep. But one thing's clear: the ghost of the Cold War was being pulled along behind the celebratory banners. Meanwhile, back in Russia, Boris Yeltsin is starting to resemble the aftermath of a college frat party, unshaven, exhausted, and covered in metaphorical beer. His popularity is nosediving faster than the ruble. The economy, already a mess, is gut-punched again in 1998 with a financial crisis that sends shockwaves through the region. Corruption blooms like a toxic algae. Oligarchs now dominate the political landscape. There's a running joke, though it's not very funny, that Russia's main exports are oil, arms, and billionaires with questionable yachts. The average Russian, meanwhile, is enduring what economists delicately refer to as a transition period, and what everyone else calls "why is everything broken" and "who stole the light bulbs?" Into this vacuum of despair steps a man with a background in shadow and a knack for control: Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Appointed Prime Minister in 1999, then acting president when Yeltsin resigns, Putin arrives like a blank page with steel eyes. He promises order, he promises dignity, he promises to make Russia great again, though in less trademarked language. And the people, battered and bewildered, respond. They want the chaos to end. They want bread on shelves, pensions in bank accounts, and trains that run on time, or at least show up eventually. If the price is fewer questions and more surveillance, well, they've paid worse. As your dream self watches Putin rise, you also notice something subtler. The Cold War didn't die, it metastasized, not into a new conflict, but into a global nervous tic. The world had been structured for decades around a simple binary: us versus them, good versus evil, democracy versus communism. Remove that, and what's left? A lot of ambiguity. And the human brain hates ambiguity. So into the gap flow new fears. Islamic extremism, rogue states, cyber threats, climate change, and beneath them all, the lingering suspicion that the Cold War was never really about ideology, it was about control. You drift through the Balkans, where the post-Cold War euphoria has curdled into bloodshed. Yugoslavia, once Tito's patchwork quilt of cultures, begins to unravel violently. Slovenia and Croatia break away. Bosnia descends into horror. NATO, once a Cold War institution, is now dropping bombs on Serbia to stop ethnic cleansing. It's a jarring image, jets designed for WW3 being used in a regional humanitarian war. But such is the new normal. Over in China, the Communist Party watches all this with narrowed eyes. In 1989, when Soviet republics were choosing freedom, Chinese students dared to do the same. They gathered in Tiananmen Square, carrying signs and hope. And then tanks came. The party survived. The protests did not. China, it seems, had learned a very different Cold War lesson. Don't loosen the grip, tighten it while you still can. But the economy? That's another story. Deng Xiaoping's reforms have taken root. By the late 90s, China is starting to look like capitalism's overachieving cousin. Markets are booming, exports are climbing, and Western companies, dazzled by cheap labor and eager consumers, are lining up to invest. The irony is thick. A country that had once decried capitalism as a disease is now the world's biggest mall. Back in the West, leaders are still holding hands and singing about globalization. The Cold War had ended, they believed, and now the world could finally become one big happy family. Trade would bring peace, internet would bring understanding, fast food would bring people together, one combo meal at a time. And yet, if you listen carefully, you hear the cracks. Terrorist networks, once funded by Cold War players, are mutating. The internet, barely a teenager, is already being used to spread conspiracy, extremism, and cats. Russia, under Putin, is slowly re-centralizing power. China is buying up resources globally. America, fresh off its self-proclaimed victory, is starting to ask questions like, what do we do without a nemesis? You, the dreaming traveller, now sense that history is looping, not in circles but in spirals. Every end is just a new starting point seen from another angle. And the Cold War, it may no longer be a battle of ideologies, but it left behind habits, alliances, wounds and myths. It's the childhood trauma of international relations, and no one's really done the therapy. You close your eyes just for a moment, because as the millennium approaches, the world is about to be reminded violently that history never actually ends. But that revelation can wait till morning. The calendar rolls over to the year 2000, and the world breathes deeply, as if resetting an Etch-a-Sketch filled with 20th century chaos. Y2K didn't melt the servers, your microwave didn't explode, and for a few glittering months, everyone wore silver clothing and believed the future might actually be fun. But as you drift into this glossy new era, the past, the Cold War, its habits and shadows, refuses to be left behind. Like glitter on your hands, it clings. Your first stop, Moscow. Vladimir Putin is now officially president, and his rise isn't marked by fire or revolution, but by a curious calm, the kind of quiet you feel just before a curtain drops. While Yeltsin danced awkwardly on tanks and TV screens, Putin speaks in short sentences, calculates before blinking, and gives off the aura of a man who knows where all the bodies are buried, because he might have filed the burial permits himself. He promises to restore dignity to the Russian state. Translation: consolidate power. He goes after the oligarchs, not all of them, just the ones who forget who's boss. The media begins to sound more synchronized. Protests are managed. Elections become less about choice and more about spectacle. And somewhere in the background, Cold War nostalgia begins to stir, not as fear, but as yearning for strength, for global respect, for the days when the West trembled. Historians still argue whether Putin's rise was inevitable, the product of chaos and humiliation, or whether the 1990s were a missed chance for real reform. Either way, by 2001, Russia is no longer asking politely to join the Western club. It's sharpening its elbows and eyeing the guest list. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America is in a peculiar mood. The Cold War is over, the internet economy is booming, and people are very busy watching a show about 6 friends who all afford Manhattan rent with vague jobs. Geopolitics, that's so last century. Then comes September 11th. The towers fall. The Pentagon is hit. The Cold War's neat architecture of threats is shattered, replaced by an enemy that doesn't wear uniforms or keep embassies. Terrorism, once a Cold War footnote, used to justify covert operations, becomes the main plot, and suddenly all those old Cold War tools, spy agencies, military alliances, ideological binaries, are pulled back off the shelf, dusted off and rebranded. It's not communism versus capitalism anymore. It's freedom versus terror. The axis changes, but the playbook feels eerily familiar. The US invades Afghanistan, citing harboring of terrorists. Then Iraq, citing, well, various things. Regime change becomes fashionable again, like a vintage coat you weren't sure still fit. The irony, many of the weapons, intelligence, and tactics being used against America in the early 2000s were Cold War leftovers, trained fighters, former allies, strategies developed to defeat the Soviet Union now turned against their architects. You drift through the Middle East, through deserts lit by burning oil fields, and you hear echoes of past Cold War games. Proxy wars, once defined by ideology, are now redrawn by religion, tribalism, and geopolitics. But the mechanics remain: support one side, destabilize the other, hope the fallout doesn't hit too close to home. And back in Russia, something clicks. Putin watches the US overstretch itself. 2 wars, massive deficits, declining global sympathy. Russia may not be a superpower in the old sense, but it can play the new game very well. It modernizes its military, tightens its grip at home, and starts to experiment with a new kind of influence campaign. Not tanks, but tweets. Not spies in trench coats, but trolls with VPNs. A new Cold War? Not quite, but you can see the scaffolding going up. Over in China, the 2000s are a rocket launch. The economy explodes with double-digit growth. Skyscrapers bloom. Bullet trains zip by. It's communism, technically, but with malls and KFC and enough consumerism to make Adam Smith blush. Western economists are giddy. Engage with China, they say. Trade will bring freedom. The theory, McDonald's nations don't fight. The reality, McDonald's nations just build islands in disputed waters. And dare you to say something. You, floating through this heady soup of hope and tension, begin to notice something deeply ironic. The Cold War ended to make the world safer. But now, in its absence, a dozen mini-conflicts, ignored grievances, and silent hostilities have come out to play. Without the rigid structure of 2 superpowers glaring at each other, everyone else has started testing the waters. India and Pakistan nearly go nuclear. North Korea, now a legacy Cold War state powered by paranoia and powdered wigs, tests a bomb into Iran inches toward nuclear capability. The arms control treaties that once held the line are quietly dying of old age. But none of this grabs headlines the way it used to. Why? Because we're distracted. Globalization has given the world smartphones, social media, and algorithmic rage. While old men debate missile ranges, young people debate memes. Attention has become the new battlefield, and in that war, the Cold War's ghosts are rearming. In the US, politics begins to mirror the old East-West dichotomy. Not literally, of course, but symbolically. Ideological polarization deepens. Echo chambers harden. A narrative emerges. The threat isn't out there. It's them, whoever them is this week. It feels familiar, like watching reruns with slightly updated costumes. The Cold War might be dead, but the need for an enemy isn't. As your dream self floats above this chaotic decade, you realize the Cold War never truly ended. It mutated. It seeped into the infrastructure of thought, into how countries see themselves, into how alliances form, into the very language of diplomacy. You smile bitterly because you know what comes next. And if this is the warm-up, the next section will be seismic. But that can wait until you've drifted a little deeper into sleep. You descend now into the smouldering 2010s, a decade that begins like a promise and ends like a cautionary tale. You glide silently across the globe as the air smells faintly of friction, not the thunderous clashes of Cold War tanks, but something subtler, more insidious. This is the age of cyber warfare, of populism, of fake news as weaponized ideology. The Cold War's carcass may be buried, but its bones have been rearranged into strange new creatures. Let's start in Crimea. It's 2014, and a familiar old game reboots with upgraded graphics. After years of quiet maneuvering, Russia makes a bold move. It invades and annexes Crimea from Ukraine, claiming to protect Russian-speaking citizens. Western governments scream, violation of international law, Russia shrugs, says it was a referendum, and issues passports like party favors. The West imposes sanctions. Putin gains approval points at home. Everyone gets flashbacks. It's a move ripped straight from Cold War theatre, but with 21st century flair. Russian soldiers without insignia, little green men, sweep across territory, while state media spins the tale into patriotic poetry. Online, bot accounts flood Twitter and Facebook with contradictory narratives, not to convince, but to confuse. Truth itself becomes the battlefield. Historians still argue whether this was the true start of Cold War 2.0, or just another ripple in a multipolar world. But one thing becomes clear: deterrence, that old Cold War magic trick, doesn't work so well when the lines between war and peace have been smeared into abstract art. Meanwhile, the United States is busy unraveling at the seams. Internal division becomes performance art. Political discourse dissolves into hashtags and half-truth. And somewhere in the background, investigations begin into whether foreign actors interfered in the 2016 election. The verdict? Yes, but not with tanks or nukes, with memes, data leaks, and well-placed trolls. Stalin had the Gulag, Putin has YouTube. And yet, even as these modern tools of subversion unfold, the old strategies still apply. NATO, despite being declared obsolete in some quarters, reasserts itself with deployments in Eastern Europe. Joint exercises are held in the Baltics. New missile systems are installed. Russia, in turn, ramps up its Arctic presence, tests hypersonic weapons, and flies bombers within flirting distance of Alaskan airspace. You float above this theatre, watching the Cold War's muscle memory kick in. It's all so rehearsed. The shows of force, the sharp diplomatic notes, the subtle espionage. Only now, instead of two superpowers locked in a ballet of annihilation, it's more like a dance marathon with exhausted partners and unpredictable tempo. In China, the story continues with its own Cold War remix. The Communist Party doubles down on control. Hong Kong erupts in protest. The Great Firewall thickens, and a social credit system emerges, part Orwell, part Silicon Valley. At the same time, China's military budget blooms. They're building islands in the South China Sea, not for vacation, but for strategic leverage. Analysts call it a salami-slicing strategy, each act too small to provoke war, but collectively impossible to ignore. And back in the US, there's a new fixation. China is no longer just a competitor, it's framed as the ideological adversary of the century. Not communism this time, but techno-authoritarianism. Surveillance capitalism versus state surveillance. TikTok diplomacy. Huawei espionage. The Cold War's moral clarity is gone, but the craving for binary framing remains. You drift into conference rooms in Brussels, Beijing, and Washington, where diplomats speak in polished monotones about strategic patience and recalibrated containment. But behind the phrases, it's the same old anxiety. Who leads? Who follows? Who blinks first? Even the arms race, once declared passé, is back with new names. Hypersonic missiles, cyber commands, AI-controlled drones. Nuclear treaties like INF and Open Skies quietly dissolve. Mutual assured destruction might now come with an AI override button and a 10-millisecond launch window. And yet the world is more connected than ever. A war like the old days, massive, clear, with borders and declarations, seems almost quaint. The Cold War was a symphony of fear. This is an improv jazz set of chaos. Proxy conflicts now come with economic strings, cloud servers and supply chains. But here's the kicker. Just like in the Cold War, the people on the ground are tired. They want stability, truth, and a future not defined by great power, mood swings. They've seen the consequences. Some still remember the drills. Others grew up playing Call of Duty with nukes as background noise. Everyone is haunted, if not by war itself, then by its possibility. And as you settle into the latter half of the 2010s, you hear a sound, faint but growing, It's not the siren of air raids or the roar of tanks. It's the slow drumbeat of distrust. Between nations, within nations, between facts and feelings. A beat carried not by governments, but by algorithms. You understand now the Cold War was never just about borders or bombs. It was a way of organizing the world, us versus them, control versus chaos. That framework has splintered, but its pieces are everywhere. You begin to drift downward into a new decade, and the world, once again, is about to change. You slip softly into the 2020s, a decade so far defined by uncertainty, face masks, and the increasingly loud static of international suspicion. The Cold War, long assumed to be a relic of grainy documentaries and high school history classes, is suddenly a trending topic again. Only now, instead of hiding under desks from nuclear blasts, people hide under blankets from news alerts and global supply chain breakdowns. Cozy, right? Let's set the scene. You're in Wuhan, China. Not because you like bats or pangolins, but because a virus has just begun its global tour. COVID-19 spreads across the planet faster than any ideology or warhead ever could. Borders close, economies stall, the world hits pause. And yet geopolitical tension does the opposite. It thrives. Historians still argue whether the pandemic was a geopolitical accelerant or merely a mirror. Either way, it rips the veneer off modern global cooperation. The US and China engage in a war of words over the virus's origins. Diplomatic cables bristle with blame. Terms like Chinese virus and Wuhan flu spread almost as virulently as the virus itself. Conspiracy theories bloom. Cold War rhetoric is suddenly pandemic proof. But here's the twist. The Cold War was about ideology. This new version, it's about systems. Autocracy versus democracy. Central control versus liberal disorder. Who contained the virus better? Who recovered faster? Who exported vaccines more generously or manipulatively? Suddenly medical aid becomes soft power. Russia's Sputnik 5 and China's Sinovac aren't just vaccines. They're tools of diplomacy. Meanwhile, you drift to a screen in someone's lap where TikTok dances are set against headlines of banned apps and national security concerns. The US threatens to ban Chinese tech platforms, citing data privacy. China retaliates. It's not nuclear brinkmanship, but data brinkmanship. Instead of missile silos, it's server farms. Instead of spies in trench coats, it's backdoor firmware and unexpected updates. In Russia, Putin amends the constitution, resetting term limits, so he can potentially rule until 20. The country moves deeper into authoritarian chic, clamping down on opposition with Cold War-style methods, poisonings, arrests, media blackouts. The ghost of the KGB laces its boots. Belarus erupts in protest. Navalny is poisoned, again. Mass arrests follow. The EU wrings its hands. NATO holds emergency meetings. But this isn't Berlin night. There's no wall to storm. Just hashtags, press releases, and economic sanctions. Half measures that taste like aspirin in a plague. And speaking of half measures, you float now to Washington, where the US has just weathered its own democratic crisis. The Capitol has been stormed. Trust in institutions is at historic lows. The beacon of freedom looks a little flickery. For the first time in decades, America's internal fragility becomes a strategic advantage for its rivals. If the Cold War was a chess match, this is a round of Jenga played on a table that keeps shaking. China, for its part, grows bolder. It tightens its grip on Hong Kong. It signals loud intentions toward Taiwan. Military exercises intensify. Warships hum across the South China Sea, like sharks in a kiddie pool. The US sends ships too. Neither side wants war, but neither can blink either. Cyber attacks become the new reconnaissance flights. Solar winds, Colonial Pipeline, Microsoft Exchange. You don't need spies anymore, just a keyboard and a bad attitude. The battlefields are invisible. the wounds economic, and the goal, not to destroy, but to destabilize, keep the enemy doubting themselves, confused, divided. It's judo geopolitics. And yet, you wonder, is this really a Cold War? After all, Russia and China trade with the West. People still vacation across ideological lines. No one's building fallout shelters, or at least not publicly. But then maybe the Cold War never needed nukes to exist. Maybe it just needed narrative tension, a sense of permanent contest. Because that's what the 2020s are shaping up to be. An era where everyone suspects everyone else of cheating at a game whose rules were never clearly explained. Alliances shift like sand. Old foes flirt with friendship, then ghost each other. India and China square off in the Himalayas. Australia bans Huawei and gets a cold shoulder from Beijing. The EU waffles between values and trade deals. And beneath it all, climate change simmers. An existential threat so vast it should have united the globe. Instead, it becomes one more wedge. Who pollutes more? Who adapts faster? Who can manufacture solar panels cheaper? Even the apocalypse has geopolitics now. You, curled up in this strange historical lullaby, begin to see the irony unfold like a tragic joke. The Cold War supposedly ended with the triumph of liberal democracy. Yet here we are, wondering aloud if that very system is fit for purpose in the 21st century, wondering if authoritarian capitalism might actually be more efficient, or terrifyingly seductive. The Cold War's tools, propaganda, espionage, economic leverage, have all been updated, but its soul, that quiet thrum of distrust and zero-sum thinking, it's back. Only this time, it's less about whose system is right and more about whose system survives. And as you float above this unraveling tapestry, you sense the approach of something heavier, not fire, not ice, but entropy, the slow unraveling of the post-Cold War order into something unrecognizable. You'd love to say, let's just wake up now, but you can't, because we haven't hit the climax yet. That comes next. You hover now on the threshold of tomorrow, your gaze shifting from the headlines of yesterday to the geopolitical chessboard that's still quietly being played beneath them. The Cold War might be over on paper, but in practice, it's just changed the dress code, swapped its trench coats for tailored suits, and updated its battlefields with 5G and facial recognition. Welcome to the era of cold peace. So much tension, so few official declarations. You begin in Taiwan, that little island with the giant spotlight. China calls it a rebellious province. The US calls it a crucial ally. Everyone else calls it, next question. Tensions simmer like water, just under a boil. Chinese jets make incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone with the regularity of Amazon deliveries. The US keeps sending routine patrols that just so happen to skirt near contested waters. It's like watching two alpha cats circle each other, tails twitching, pretending they're just out for a stroll. Historians still argue whether Taiwan will be the powder keg of the 21st century, or merely the stage on which this new cold peace continues its slow ballet. But one thing is certain, no one wants war, and everyone is preparing for it anyway. Back in the US, the pivot to Asia becomes a shuffle, then a sidestep. Budgets balloon for Indo-Pacific Command. Defense contractors salivate. Meanwhile, TikTok influencers and YouTubers unknowingly wade into propaganda battles, their content reshaped by invisible algorithms and state-sponsored trends. The Cold War had radio-free Europe. This one has beauty tutorials and Reddit threads. You move again, this time to the Arctic. Once a frozen afterthought, it's now a strategic jackpot. Melting ice reveals shipping routes and untapped resources. Russia plants flags on the seabed. The US updates its Arctic strategy. Norway starts acting like it's more than fjords and fish. Even China declares itself a near-Arctic power, which is sort of like declaring yourself a near-billionaire and hoping no one checks. In Africa, China's Belt and Road Initiative isn't just building infrastructure, it's laying foundations of influence. Ports, roads, data cables, all wrapped in debt packages more intricate than Cold War proxy funding ever was. Meanwhile, the West launches its own Build Back Better World initiative. Great branding, zero teeth. The Cold War was subtle chess. This is economic Jenga with billions at stake. And then there's space. Oh, space. No longer the final frontier. It's just another theater. Russia blows up a satellite in orbit, scattering debris like a celestial middle finger. The US forms Space Force. China lands on the moon's far side. Everyone talks about Mars, but really, they're just setting up military bases by other means. It's not just who gets there first anymore. It's who gets to deny access second. But here's a plot twist worthy of a late-night infomercial. While governments duel, corporations rise. Apple has more money than most nations. Google shapes more narratives than any intelligence agency ever dreamed of. Elon Musk launches more rockets than Russia. The Cold War had espionage and embargoes. This era has antitrust lawsuits and billionaire space rivalries. Who needs nuclear footballs when you've got Twitter polls deciding geopolitics? Amidst this strange brew, climate change continues its planetary pressure campaign. Natural disasters displace more people than most wars. Crops fail. Water becomes a bargaining chip. The old ideological Cold War wanted to save humanity from itself. This one might let it burn, so long as market share is maintained. Yet through all of this, you feel a curious softness creeping in, a weariness. Nations still posture, yes, but citizens, they protest, they tweet, they shrug. The energy of the Cold War, the apocalyptic urgency, the all-or-nothing mentality, has been replaced by something dissonant, mistrust without clear enemies, preparedness without purpose, a sense that conflict is both inevitable and inconceivable. Even the institutions that once managed this tension, the UN, NATO, the G7, now feel like grand old theatres with broken spotlights and understudies reading cue cards. They still exist, they still matter, but their authority is no longer taken as divine. And the final irony, this cold peace is more dangerous, precisely because it feels less dramatic. There are no Berlin walls to televise, no mushroom clouds to dread, just cyber attacks in the background, elections gently nudged, whispers in academic journals, trade routes rerouted, and military budgets justified by hypothetical threats. You sit with this for a moment, letting it settle like dust in the air. The Cold War was supposed to teach the world a lesson, that brinkmanship is foolish, that ideology is fragile, that diplomacy is better than destruction. And yet, here we are, same instincts, new costumes. Perhaps you smile, not because it's funny, but because history has always been a bit of a prankster. Just when you think you've finished the story, it hands you a sequel with the same plot and new actors. And still, the night goes on. The world turns. Somewhere, a diplomat rehearses a speech. Somewhere else, a teenager live streams from a bunker-turned bedroom, blissfully unaware that the old war is still dancing in the shadows of their timeline. You tuck in deeper now, the climax approaches, and no one knows who writes the next scene. You're floating now toward the edge of endings, the soft hush before the curtain falls, the stillness just before the credits roll, and in this near-silent drift, you can hear the Cold War exhaling one last time, not with a bang, but with a long, unresolved sigh. Because even in death, it seems, this war left a legacy too stubborn to be buried. Let's talk legacy, not the bronze statues or the dusty textbooks, but the invisible wiring it left behind. You see, the Cold War didn't just build missiles and borders. It built systems, legal systems, trade systems, media systems, psychological systems. The world was divided into two, not just physically but mentally. Freedom versus control, truth versus propaganda, East versus West. These binaries became the mental architecture of generations. And they didn't vanish, they just updated their firmware, Historians still argue whether the Cold War ever really ended. Sure, the Soviet flag came down, walls were torn apart, and McDonald's opened in Moscow, but the habits it forged, the instincts, the fears, the fallback positions, they're very much alive. In fact, you could argue they've become global culture. Polarization is now a feature, not a bug. Just take a look at international politics today. Democracy itself, once considered the definitive victor of the Cold War, now stumbles awkwardly like a dad trying to use TikTok. Autocracies, once caricatured as outdated and brittle, now swagger through conferences wearing Gucci and quoting GDP statistics. Hungary, Poland, India, Brazil, all these so-called democracies walk a tightrope between voter mandate and authoritarian impulse. Meanwhile, the US struggles to keep its own house in order, its moral authority somewhere between a faded bumper sticker and a drunken uncle's holiday toast. And then there's the technology. Cold War surveillance was about bugs in hotel rooms. Today, it's your smart fridge tattling to advertisers. The KGB would have loved Alexa. China's social credit system is basically George Orwell's fever dream turned product demo. And as governments struggle to keep up, private corporations, unaccountable, borderless, become the new gatekeepers of truth and trust. Remember when you were told the Cold War was fought to preserve the free flow of information? Well, now it flows so freely that no one knows what's real. Disinformation campaigns, deepfakes, troll farms. It's not about hiding the truth anymore. It's about drowning it in noise. So where does that leave you, dear sleeper? Adrift in a world that inherited all the caution and paranoia of the Cold War, but without the clarity. No Berlin Wall to protest, no nuclear standoff to dread, just 1,000 tiny manipulations, gently nudging your world into directions you didn't choose and can't quite name. And yet, amid this murkiness, you catch glimpses of something quieter, small resistances, acts of clarity. A student in Belarus live-streaming her arrest, a coder in Nigeria building tools for encrypted speech, protesters in Hong Kong projecting their slogans with lasers to avoid facial recognition. These aren't battles for global domination, they're micro-rebellions against control itself. Because if the Cold War taught the world anything, it's that people, given half a chance, will not stay contained. Whether it's Berliners chipping away at concrete, or whistleblowers leaking secrets, or TikTok teens hijacking political hashtags, there's always leakage, always friction, always that one voice that refuses to lower its volume. But perhaps the biggest twist in this legacy is existential. The Cold War promised a future, one shaped by victory, rebuilt with certainty. Instead, it gave us an anxious peace, and a planet that's rapidly overheating. The arms race is over, and now it's the climate clock that ticks. The missiles are still there, of course, silently waiting, but the real threat is melting ice, rising seas, and the slow collapse of the ecosystems that once ignored our politics. You wonder if the Cold War was fought to secure a future. What kind of future did it secure? And as you curl in closer to the story, breathing slower now, you realize that the Cold War's final legacy might not be in who won or lost, but in who still remembers, in the stories passed down, the sigh of your grandmother when she sees a wall on TV, the nervous laugh of a historian when asked if we're in Cold War II, the child who asks, why were they fighting, and no one quite knows how to answer without gesturing vaguely at the sky and saying, it's complicated. It is complicated and unresolved, and still unfolding. But it's also fading. The Iron Curtain may have fallen, but the iron in our blood remembers, not with terror, but with a quiet ache, a knowledge that peace is never perfect, and endings are rarely clean. So now, as this chapter begins to close, you let go of the story, not because it's finished, but because it's become part of the air you breathe. The Cold War is over, they said. Maybe, or maybe it's just asleep, like you. And now, my dear traveller through time and tension, you arrive at the hush after the storm, The moment when history doesn't roar, but murmurs. You've made it, not just to the end of a war, but to the end of an era that never truly ended, a conflict fought with bombs. Yes, but more often with books, broadcasts, and breakfast cereal mascots, subtly whispering which system made better citizens. You lay back, the echoes of Moscow and Washington, slowly dissolving into the night air. The Cold War, for all its fire and frost, was never really about armies. It was about fear, fear of invasion, of ideology, of being on the wrong side of tomorrow. And when that fear lifted, no fireworks followed, no victory parade, just a sigh of relief, a muttered prayer, and paperwork. Because yes, the fall of the Soviet Union didn't come with a Hollywood score. It came with forms, border checks, awkward interviews, broken pensions, confused children waking up in new countries with the same wallpaper. Empires don't crash, they leak, they stumble, they fade. The USSR was no exception. Historians still argue whether the Cold War was won or simply outlasted. Some say Reagan's Star Wars scared them into submission. Others say it was the photocopiers, those tiny capitalist machines that quietly spread ideas faster than any tank. And then there's the economy, the environment, the culture wars. Choose your poison, or choose them all. History rarely gives you a single answer. It prefers a buffet. So where does that leave you curled up now, blinking against sleep, in a world shaped by a war you didn't vote for, but inherited? A world that remains divided, but more subtly. A world where Russian bots whisper, where Soviet spies once did, where satellite images replace propaganda posters, and where we still fear the end of the world, just not all at once. Perhaps that's the true legacy. Not peace, not victory, but the uneasy knowledge that we survived by accident, that diplomacy, luck, and a few very tired generals managed to outmaneuver ego just long enough for us to keep breathing. And if that sounds bleak, don't worry, because there is hope too. In every student who studies history, not to memorize it, but to improve it. In every person who recognizes propaganda, not because they were told it was wrong, but because they learn to think for themselves. In every moment you choose compassion over ideology, conversation over conflict. You stretch out now, your limbs heavier, your mind gentler. The missiles sleep, the wall is dust. The children of Cold War soldiers now stream video games together, their usernames indistinguishable. Maybe this isn't victory, but it's something better, continuation. You close your eyes. The Cold War was loud. But peace is a whisper. And now you listen to it. Now then, the missiles are rusting, the curtains are drawn, but something still hums faintly behind the scenes. Because even after the Cold War was declared over, the world didn't exactly return to factory settings. You may have noticed the power plays, still very much in season, the global paranoia, alive and casually scrolling Twitter, and those cozy old enemies. They've simply swapped uniforms for suits and summit passes. Let's peek into the 1990s. The Soviet Union has evaporated like a fever dream. In its place, a messy patchwork of republics blinking into the blinding light of capitalism. Russia, the largest and most confused of these, finds itself under the unsure stewardship of Boris Yeltsin, a man whose leadership style could best be described as fluctuating blood alcohol levels. With the economy in free fall, and the mafia treating privatization like a Black Friday sale, the dream of freedom quickly becomes a hangover. Former Soviet citizens go from queuing for bread to fighting over Adidas tracksuits in flea markets. It's not the future they were promised, it's just a different flavor of chaos. And in the West, the West declares victory with the smugness of someone who thinks they invented brunch. There's talk of a peace dividend, of finally cashing in all that Cold War anxiety into world peace, economic harmony, and democracy. NATO, that old Cold War military club, was supposed to be winding down, but instead it starts expanding eastward, like a dad discovering how fun online shopping is. Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, they all join. Eventually even the Baltic states cozy up. Russia watches this with all the calm detachment of a cat being slowly pushed into a bathtub. Remember, this was the very alliance that existed to contain the USSR, and now it's cozying up to its former limbs. Historians still argue whether NATO's expansion was necessary or a reckless middle finger. Some say it helped stabilize fledgling democracies. Others say it planted the seeds for future conflicts. Spoiler alert, the seeds grew. Russia, meanwhile, bumbles through a turbulent decade of financial crises, oligarch game shows, and political drama that would make an HBO producer salivate. And then, at the very end of that decade, just as everyone is starting to forget about the Cold War altogether, a man rises quietly from the grey corridors of the FSB. His name is Vladimir Putin. Not exactly the nostalgic type, but certainly the vengeful one, a former KGB agent who once called the collapse of the USSR the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, which is quite a claim considering that century also contained 2 world wars and the invention of the fax machine. Under Putin, Russia begins to recenter itself, not with bombs, but with gas pipelines, cyber tactics, and a refined taste for plausible deniability. Georgia, Chechnya, Syria, Ukraine all become chapters in a new kind of Cold War, not frozen, but simmering, like a pot left on low heat, just waiting to boil again. And while all that unfolds, the West enters its own flavor of post-Cold War confusion. September 11 reorients the compass. Suddenly it's not communism, but terrorism that haunts the headlines. The war on terror becomes the new moral crusade. But underneath that, Cold War habits linger: secrecy, surveillance, moral binaries dressed up in fresh uniforms, freedom fries instead of liberty bonds. But the melody? Oh, it's familiar. And here you are, dear listener, nestled beneath all this history, not watching missiles fly, but watching TikToks, not fearing Soviet spies, but worrying about apps that track your sleep. The Cold War's long shadow still stretches across your screen, your economy, your map, and even if the world never quite learned how to make peace permanent, you at least have learned to drift through it. Let's keep drifting, shall we? And now you come to the final flicker in this long, strange theatre of silence and tension. The Cold War is over, they said, and yet it never quite feels like the credits rolled. Maybe because no one clapped. Maybe because the audience is still seated, glancing nervously at each other, wondering if there's a post-credit scene involving Taiwan or the Arctic melting faster than expected. The legacy of the Cold War isn't a relic you keep in a dusty museum. It's a constant whisper in your daily life. When your smartphone pings with news of a new arms build-up, that's the Cold War humming through the wires. When you see a film with a villain who happens to be vaguely Slavic, wears fur and scowls a lot, that's the Cold War writing your Netflix scripts. When you hear nuclear deterrence thrown around like it's still the 80s, that's the Cold War's ghost doing karaoke. And the nuclear stockpiles, oh, they're still there, still primed, still occasionally updated, like awkward old software. We may not build fallout shelters in our backyards anymore, but we still live in a world one misunderstanding away from obliteration. MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, was never a comforting acronym. It just worked, for reasons no one fully trusted, and it still lingers, not in textbooks, but in policies, in treaties, in military budgets passed quietly at midnight sessions. But let's zoom out, because there's something beautiful too, in this chaotic inheritance, in the music that crossed borders despite iron curtains, in the laughter shared at satirical plays, in cramped kitchens in Leningrad, in the graffiti scrawled across the Berlin Wall, each line a declaration that someone, somewhere, refused to be silent, in the weird wonky dance of diplomacy that somehow kept us from ending it all in a blinding flash. The Cold War gave us lessons wrapped in riddles, That fear can build empires, but also crumble them. That ideology is a hell of a drug. That borders drawn by politicians often fail to contain the hearts of people. That progress doesn't always mean peace, and peace doesn't always mean justice. And that sometimes the greatest victories are invisible. A war that didn't happen, a missile that wasn't launched, a leader who paused. Historians still debate when the Cold War really ended. Some say 89, when the wall fell. Others say 91, with the Soviet flag lowering for the last time. But maybe it never truly ends. Maybe it just evolves quietly, reshaping itself into new rivalries, new tech, new battlegrounds, new memes, and maybe, just maybe, the reason it hasn't returned in full force is because you're here, learning, listening, letting history hold your hand before sleep. You, my dear dreamer, are part of that legacy, not as a pawn, but as a witness and a whisperer of better futures. So close your eyes now and let the chill of history become a breeze behind you. The world turns, the sun will rise. The headlines may look familiar, but now you know the melody behind them. You've seen the cold heart of the 20th century, and you've made it warmly to the 21st. Sleep well, little peacemaker, and remember, tomorrow is still unwritten.